They didn't ask for my boarding pass or name. They just said grand larceny loud enough for everyone to stare. I knew exactly who made the call. My parents timed it to the minute. I had one flight to catch, one hearing to attend, and one inheritance my father needed to control. But they forgot you cannot frame someone who lives for paperwork. I let the police open my bag and watched their lie collapse in real time. My name is Isla Rivera. Most people. When intercepted by armed airport police exactly 3 steps from the jet bridge, experience a predictable physiological response. The heart rate spikes violently against the ribs, the palms sweat, and the brain scrambles for a defense against an accusation they have not even fully heard yet. But when 2 officers in heavy tactical vests stepped directly into my path at Terminal 2 of Raleigh-Durham International, I did not feel panic. I felt a cold, sharp sting of realization. "Step out of line, ma'am. Keep your hands where we can see them." They did not whisper to preserve my dignity. They announced it. The phrases grand larceny and flight risk echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings of the departure concourse, loud enough to completely halt the chaotic shuffle of boarding Group 3. Hundreds of eyes pivoted toward me in perfect unison, passengers dropping their overpriced coffees and adjusting their travel neck pillows to witness the sudden, free spectacle. They escorted me away from Gate Charlie 17, my absolute only ticket out of North Carolina today. I risked a glance at the glowing digital departure board hanging overhead. I had exactly 37 minutes until the boarding doors sealed shut for good. Today was not just any routine business travel day. Today was the probate hearing for my grandfather's estate. It was a hearing meticulously structured so that my physical absence would trigger a catastrophic legal default, instantly shifting power to the very people trying to destroy me. The officers led me into what the airport staff probably called a security annex. But what was unmistakably designed as a fishbowl, it was a room walled entirely in heavy, soundproof glass, situated right in the middle of the busiest main corridor. Every weary traveler, every uniformed pilot, every flight attendant dragging a suitcase past the room could look in and see me sitting alone on a sterile metal bench, bathed in harsh, unforgiving fluorescent light. I was a living museum exhibit of presumed guilt. A cautionary tale for the holiday traveler to gossip about when they landed. The heavy door clicked open, and Sergeant Naomi Keats walked in. I read her silver name tag before she even bothered to look up from her military-grade tablet. She possessed the rigid, squared-off posture of someone heavily accustomed to dealing with hysterics, dramatic tears, and desperate bargaining from guilty parties. She leaned against the cold metal table separating us, slowly crossing her arms, intentionally letting the silence stretch out between us. I knew the tactic. It was a standard interrogation maneuver, designed to make the suspect uncomfortable enough to start babbling and incriminate themselves. "We received an emergency tip from a highly concerned family member," Sergeant Keats finally said, her voice a flat, practiced monotone devoid of empathy. "They reported that you are currently in possession of approximately $250,000 in stolen estate jewelry. They also indicated you were actively attempting to flee the state on this morning flight to liquidate the assets through illicit channels. That elevates this situation to a major felony charge. Ms. Rivera." She stopped speaking, her dark eyes locked firmly on my face, waiting for the emotional dam to break. She fully expected me to scream, to cry, to frantically deny the horrible charges, to plead about a terrible familial misunderstanding. She expected the messy, predictable, chaotic reaction of a desperate daughter caught red-handed stealing a fortune from her own grieving family. Instead, I sat perfectly still, my breathing even and controlled, my mind, rigorously conditioned by years of tracing fraudulent supply chains, dissecting corporate lies, and auditing complex financial malfeasance at Kestrel ARC compliance, bypassed the emotional sting of my parents' betrayal entirely. My brain immediately went to work on the cold logistics of the setup. At Kestrel ARC, I hunted the intentional errors, the paper trails meant to hide crimes. I knew how liars constructed their traps. I looked right back into Sergeant Keats' eyes. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not shake. I asked exactly one precise question. What exact time did the call come in, Sergeant? And what was the specific, detailed description of the bag holding the allegedly stolen jewelry? Sergeant Keats blinked, her crossed arms loosening just a fraction. The clinical question clearly threw off her established rhythm. Suspects facing $250,000 in serious theft charges usually do not ask for clerical timestamps and evidence inventory descriptions. She glanced down at her illuminated tablet screen, her brow furrowing slightly as she scrolled. The call was logged by our dispatch at 8:14 this morning, she replied, a sudden hint of caution creeping into her professional tone. The caller specifically stated the items were concealed inside a small black velvet pouch, and that the pouch was located in the front zipper compartment of your black leather carry-on bag. 8:14. Exactly 15 minutes after I had scanned my boarding pass and passed through the main security checkpoint, a perfectly calculated, mathematically precise window to ensure I was deep inside the secure terminal, completely isolated from legal counsel, and virtually guaranteed to miss my outbound flight while being detained and thoroughly searched. My father always was a man who appreciated precision timing when executing a hostile takeover. I reached down for the sturdy handle of my black leather carry-on, sitting on the scuffed linoleum floor beside my bench. The younger officer stationed quietly by the door immediately rested a tense hand on his duty belt, but Keats waved him off with a quick flick of her fingers. I lifted the heavy bag and placed it squarely in the dead center of the metal table between us. I turned it so the zipper of the front pocket faced her directly. "Then open it," I said, my voice remaining as steady and relentless as the ticking second hand on the wall clock above her head. "But I need you to document every single thing you find in that specific pocket. Look very carefully, Sergeant, because if this baseless search makes me miss my flight today, my parents will gain default control of a massive legal estate they are permanently barred from touching." Keats stared at me, the ironclad certainty in her eyes wavering for the very first time since she walked into the fishbowl. The psychological script had violently flipped. She reached out and firmly grasped the metal zipper pull of my bag. I watched her hand move, my pulse finally finding a slow, methodical, victorious rhythm. My parents had planned this vicious ambush, assuming I would crumble under the public humiliation, the flashing police lights, and the terrifying threat of a uniform. They relied entirely on my fear. They thought this was a high-stakes game of emotions. But they forgot who they raised. They forgot what I do for a living every single day. This was not a game of emotions. This was a game of paperwork. Growing up a Whitlock meant existing as a prop in a meticulously curated exhibit of suburban perfection. My mother, Diane Whitlock, measured her entire self-worth by charity gala invitations and the pristine, unblemished optics of our family reputation. Her reality was built entirely on the fragile foundation of public perception, carefully ignoring any rotting wood beneath the floorboards. My father, Grant Whitlock, operated on a completely different currency: control. If he could not micromanage a person, a financial portfolio, or a dinner table narrative, he considered it a direct and violent threat to his sovereignty. I was his most persistent, infuriating threat. The rebellion had started early, cementing itself permanently the day I turned 18 and legally changed my surname. I chose Rivera, the maiden name of my mother and the last name of my grandfather, Javier Rivera. Grandfather Javier was the only adult in my bleak childhood who looked at me and saw a fiercely independent person instead of a manageable asset or a photo opportunity. He taught me how to read balance sheets when I was 12 and told me never to sign anything I had not read twice, to my father. Discarding the Whitlock name was an unforgivable act of treason, a public slap in the face. To me, it was the only oxygen in a suffocating house. When Grandfather Javier died, just over 3 weeks ago, the grief nearly broke me, but he did not leave behind a simple document that could be easily digested and casually discarded by greedy, grasping hands. He left a financial fortress. His will was an intricate, brilliant labyrinth of blind trusts and highly specific legal stipulations, culminating in a critical appointment at the probate hearing scheduled for exactly 10 o'clock this morning. He named me the sole primary executor, bypassing my mother entirely and locking my father out of the vault. But grandfather's attorneys had built a necessary legal failsafe into the document, a standard clause designed for extreme worst-case scenarios. My father had somehow sniffed out this clause and decided to exploit it. The condition was absolute and terrifyingly simple. If I failed to appear physically in the courtroom today to sign the initial sworn oath, the judge would legally rule me unavailable to serve. The right to petition for the role of temporary executor would instantly default to the next of kin, my mother, which meant my father. Grant had been salivating over that precise contingency for 21 grueling days. If he got temporary control, he could bleed the liquid accounts dry before a formal audit could ever be ordered. At Kestrel Arc Compliance, my job is to dissect corporate anatomy. I spend 50 to 60 hours a week tracing invisible lines between offshore shell corporations, flagging intentional ledger discrepancies, and hunting down the deliberate, arrogant mistakes that white-collar criminals leave behind. I know what a hidden agenda looks like long before it materializes into an actionable crime. The warning signs at home had started flashing blindingly bright the very morning after the funeral. My father, a man who historically could not tell a precious sapphire from a piece of cheap sea glass, suddenly developed an intense, granular interest in grandfather Javier's estate jewelry. He cornered me in the hallway of my grandfather's empty house, demanding exact professional appraisals, locations of hidden safety deposit boxes, and specific inventories of vintage gold watches and heirloom rings. His eyes were cold and calculating. His questions were not fueled by sentimental mourning. They were tactical, predatory inquiries. He was taking inventory of untraceable assets. My mother played her assigned supporting role flawlessly. Diane drifted through the mandatory mourning period, wrapped in tasteful black designer fabrics, dabbing perfectly dry eyes with expensive tissues whenever wealthy neighbors arrived with casseroles. Yet, whenever I attempted to sit down and discuss the necessary estate tax filings or the immediate transfer of title deeds, she suddenly became overwhelmed by performative grief and fled the room. She categorically refused to look at a single page of legal documentation. Her only genuine terror was the possibility of a messy public scandal that might tarnish the Whitlock family crest. She would let my father steal the world as long as he did it quietly. Then there was Evan. My younger brother was the ultimate golden child, a man perfectly molded by years of conditioning to echo my father's grievances and validate my mother's endless anxieties. Evan never once questioned the toxic family doctrine whenever I pushed for basic transparency regarding grandfather's frozen accounts. Evan would shake his head, cross his arms defensively, and call me a bitter troublemaker. He told anyone who would listen that I was deliberately trying to fracture our fragile, grieving family with my paranoid, aggressive compliance officer mindset. He was the perfect loyal soldier for parents who needed an alibi. They all looked at me and thought I was blinded by my grief, too busy mourning the only man who ever loved me to notice the heavy machinery moving in the shadows. But you simply cannot spend a decade auditing deeply fraudulent supply chains and not recognize when your own blood relatives are laying down the tracks to railroad you. I saw the trap being built piece by agonizing piece. I noticed the hushed phone calls my father abruptly ended the second I walked into the kitchen. I cataloged the subtle, manipulative ways my mother tried to convince me to stay in Raleigh for just a few extra days, to rest my mind instead of traveling to the hearing out west. I knew a massive betrayal was imminent. I had spent the last 72 hours meticulously fortifying my legal position, quietly gathering the exact, undeniable documentation required to dismantle whatever bomb Grant Whitlock planned to detonate. I had prepared entirely for the inevitable day my parents would try to frame me to seize the Rivera estate. I knew they would strike today. I just never expected them to be bold enough, or foolish enough, to execute their trap in the middle of a heavily guarded airport security zone. The heavy brass zipper of my leather carry-on gave way with a sharp, metallic hiss. Sergeant Keats slid her hand into the dark, narrow front compartment. For a fraction of a second, the thick air inside the glass room seemed to freeze entirely. I watched her shoulder muscles flex under her dark uniform. She found exactly what she had been explicitly told to look for. Her hand emerged holding a small, drawstring pouch. It was made of deep, crushed black velvet. The younger patrol officer standing guard by the locked door shifted his weight, his hand dropping instinctively back down to rest heavily on the grip of his radio. Keats did not smile, but a grim, satisfied certainty settled over her features. In her mind, the anonymous tip had just been fully validated. The physical evidence was right here in her palm, matching the exact description provided by the concerned citizen on the recorded dispatch line. She had caught the fleeing thief right at the finish line. She gripped the bottom of the velvet bag and held it directly over the center of the scratched steel table. She pulled the black strings apart. She tipped it upside down. She expected the heavy, unmistakable clatter of platinum settings, the dull thud of vintage gold watches, and the sharp scatter of loose, brilliant cut diamonds hitting the metal surface. She braced herself for $250,000 of stolen family heritage to spill out under the harsh fluorescent lights. Instead, there was almost no sound at all. A single, neatly folded piece of thick, watermarked paper drifted down, landing silently on the table. A split second later, a rigid piece of white plastic dropped beside it with a hollow, anticlimactic clack. Keats froze, her hands still hovering in the air holding the empty, flattened velvet bag. She stared at the two items. There were no diamonds. There were no pearls. There was absolutely nothing of intrinsic monetary value. She slowly lowered the empty pouch, her brow furrowing into a tight knot of profound confusion. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice losing its previous authoritative edge. She reached out and picked up the plastic card. It was blank except for a high contrast, heavily encrypted black and white QR code printed squarely in the center. She set it down and picked up the folded document. As she opened it, I watched her eyes dart across the bold, embossed lettering stamped across the top header. "That is a certified chain of custody receipt," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any smugness. "It was issued by Vault Bridge Secure Logistics. Exactly 72 hours ago, an independent, bonded auditor stood in my grandfather's study. That auditor watched me catalog every single piece of that estate jewelry. They watched me place those items into a tamper-evident, military-grade transport bag. They heat-sealed it, signed the exterior, and logged it into their proprietary tracking system." Keats traced her index finger over the raised red notary seal pressed into the bottom corner of the heavy paper. I could see the gears aggressively turning behind her dark eyes. The foundational premise of her entire morning was rapidly disintegrating. "The assets your caller described," I continued, leaning slightly forward, "are currently sitting inside a subterranean, climate-controlled, heavily armed private vault facility. They are legally frozen. No one can touch them without a direct court order. Not me, and certainly not the person who called your dispatch desk this morning." The silence in the interrogation room shifted. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of an impending arrest. It was the sharp, dangerous silence of a police officer realizing she had been manipulated. The color drained slightly from Keats's face as the severe legal implications washed over her. If my document was genuine, then the emergency tip was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated, malicious lie. It was a felony false police report, specifically designed to weaponize local law enforcement to illegally detain a citizen. "Verify it," I offered smoothly. "There is a toll-free authentication hotline printed right there on the second line beneath the logo. Call them right now. Read them the alphanumeric seal code stamped in blue ink next to the date." Keats did not hesitate. She pulled her department-issued smartphone from her tactical vest and aggressively punched in the digits. She pressed the speakerphone button and set the device flat on the table so we could both hear. The line rang twice before a crisp, automated routing system clicked over to a live operator. "Vault Bridge Secure Logistics, Authentication Desk," a bright professional voice announced through the tiny speaker. How may I assist you with your custody inquiry today? This is Sergeant Naomi Keats with the Airport Police Department, she said, her tone suddenly devoid of the aggressive interrogation rhythm. She sounded entirely like an investigator now. I need to immediately verify a secure transport receipt. The primary seal code is Delta 732. I listened to the rapid, staccato sound of a keyboard clacking loudly on the other end of the line. The wait lasted perhaps 15 seconds, but in the sterile fishbowl, it felt like an hour. Thank you for holding, Sergeant, the operator replied. I can confirm that the seal code Delta 732 is fully authenticated. The corresponding sealed package was successfully transported and delivered to Vault Unit B-17. The current status is flagged as strictly secure. The package remains intact and untampered. Understood, Keats said quietly. Thank you for your time. She tapped the screen to end the call. The dial tone died, leaving the room submerged in silence once again. Keats looked down at the paper, then slowly raised her eyes to meet mine. The dynamic between us had completely inverted. I was no longer a flight risk or a grand larceny suspect. I was the surviving victim of a very serious, highly orchestrated criminal interference plot. Someone had used her badge, her authority, and her jurisdiction as a pawn in a private war. Law enforcement officers possess a deep, abiding hatred for people who file false reports to settle personal vendettas. She did not offer a profound, groveling apology. I did not expect one, nor did I need one. The furious, rigid set of her jaw told me everything I needed to know about how she planned to handle the person who placed that call. Keats picked up the plastic QR card and the certified receipt, handing them back to me with a sharp, respectful nod. She turned her head toward the younger officer by the door. "Unlock it," she ordered sharply. She turned back to me, her posture snapping back to perfect, rigid professionalism. "Gather your belongings. Ms. Rivera, you are completely free to go. I am going to personally escort you straight to your departure gate to ensure you do not experience any further delays." I unzipped my leather bag, just enough to slide the document safely inside. I did not shove the paper away carelessly. I placed the chain of custody receipt precisely into a specialized waterproof folder. I smoothed the edges with my thumb. To a casual observer, I was simply packing up to catch a flight. But as I zipped the bag closed, I felt a deep, resonant calm settle firmly into my bones. I was carefully tucking that receipt away like a mason laying down the very first brick. It was the foundational piece of a heavy, impenetrable wall that was eventually going to collapse directly onto my father. I practically sprinted down the jet bridge, the heavy fabric of my coat flapping against my knees. The gate agent had already started the final boarding countdown. Her hand hovering over the heavy metal door, I slipped past her with exactly 2 minutes to spare. Finding my window seat in row 14, I collapsed into the narrow cushion, shoving my leather bag roughly beneath the seat in front of me. My physical body was still reacting to the adrenaline of the interrogation room. My heart hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm against my sternum, and my lungs burned from the sprint across the terminal, but my mind was entirely divorced from my physical state. The emotional shock had completely evaporated, leaving behind a profound, glacial clarity. This was the precise mental state I entered during the final hours of a brutal corporate audit. I was no longer a daughter reeling from a familial betrayal. I was a compliance investigator staring at a deeply flawed ledger, and my parents were the fraudulent entries waiting to be exposed. Before I could even fasten my seatbelt, my phone began to vibrate violently in my palm. It was not a single, polite notification. It was a relentless, sustained barrage of digital panic. I stared at the illuminated screen, watching the names of my immediate family members stack up in a chaotic cascade of text messages. I did not read the actual content of the messages first. In my line of work, the raw data always tells a far more honest story than the narrative words constructed around it. I looked strictly at the timestamps. My father had sent his first message at precisely 8:20 in the morning. That was merely 6 minutes after the initial police dispatch call had been placed. His message was brief and dripping with faux concern. He wrote that he hoped my flight was smooth and asked me to call him when I landed. It was the text of a man supremely confident in his trap, establishing a completely innocent digital alibi for the exact moment I was supposed to be handcuffed in Terminal 2. But the timeline shifted abruptly. At 8:45, 25 minutes later, the confident tone vanished. A new message arrived consisting of 3 words, demanding that I call him immediately. This was the exact window when the airport police likely attempted to contact the anonymous tipster to inform them the report was entirely unfounded and potentially criminal. The hunter suddenly realized his snare was empty. By 8:52, the texts from my father devolved into overt, desperate threats. He warned me that I was making a catastrophic mistake, that walking into the Santa Fe courthouse would ruin my life, and that I had no idea what forces I was playing with. The panic was palpable, radiating through the glowing pixels. My mother took a softer, far more insidious approach. Her message, delivered at 8:55, begged me to just come back to the house. She pleaded with me not to make a big deal out of a simple misunderstanding, insisting we could handle everything quietly as a family. She was terrified of the impending public spectacle. She wanted to sweep the felony police report under her expensive Persian rugs. Finally, there was Evan. My brother opted for pure, unadulterated venom. He declared that I was completely selfish, actively destroying our family, and causing our parents unbearable distress during a time of mourning. I locked the screen and tossed the phone onto my lap. The sheer escalation of their panic did not align with a simple, greedy grab for inheritance money. Framing someone at a federal airport checkpoints carries an astronomical level of personal risk. My father was a man who preferred to manipulate behind closed doors, wielding influence through quiet coercion and subtle legal threats. He despised messy, public confrontations. For him to resort to a felony false police report meant he was completely out of options. He was not acting out of greed today. He was acting out of pure, unadulterated terror. I closed my eyes and sifted through my recent memories, hunting for the missing variable. A specific fragment of conversation from 3 weeks ago drifted to the surface of my mind. I had walked past my grandfather's old study and heard my father pacing furiously inside, speaking in a hushed, frantic tone on his cellular phone. I had only caught one distinct phrase. He had said he absolutely needed the payment finalized and transferred before Friday. At the time, I assumed he was arguing with a contractor or a stubborn broker, but viewing that memory through the lens of this morning's spectacular ambush, a new, chilling hypothesis took shape. It was not a standard business debt. It was a massive, immediate liability. My father did not just want to eventually control the Rivera estate. He fundamentally needed the absolute legal authority to liquidate specific assets today. If I arrived at the courthouse and officially assumed the role of executor, his access to that vital lifeline would be permanently severed. Friday was merely 3 days away. The aircraft engines roared to life, pushing us back from the gate. I waited with agonizing patience as we taxied, ascended, and finally leveled off at 30,000 feet. The instant the captain announced the in-flight wireless internet was active, I purchased a connection pass. I bypassed the standard phone dialer and opened an encrypted audio calling application. I typed in the direct private number for Mara Ellison, the lead estate attorney who held the keys to Grandfather Javier's complex will. She answered on the first ring. "Isla," Mara said, her voice sharp and alert. "Are you at the gate in Santa Fe? I expected you to be landing soon." "I am currently somewhere over the Midwest," I replied, keeping my voice hushed against the ambient drone of the jet engines. I encountered a significant delay at the departure terminal. My family attempted to forcibly prevent me from attending the hearing. They called the airport police and falsely reported that I was fleeing the jurisdiction with $250,000 in stolen estate jewelry. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Mara was a seasoned legal veteran who had navigated decades of vicious family disputes. But the sheer audacity of a coordinated airport arrest clearly shocked her. "Are you safe?" she demanded. "Did they file formal charges?" I am perfectly fine, I assured her. I used the secure transit receipts you and I arranged last week. The police verified the chain of custody and released me immediately. The officer handling the case is now investigating it as a malicious false report. But Mara, their reaction to my escape is completely disproportionate. My father is panicking. He is desperate to gain the temporary executor appointment this morning. He has a massive, undisclosed financial deadline arriving this Friday. He needs the estate's liquid capital right now. Mara fell silent for a long, heavy moment. When she finally spoke, her tone was entirely stripped of its usual brisk, professional armor. It sounded quiet, grim, and deeply reverent. "Isla," Mara said slowly, weighing every single word. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man. He understood the darkest corners of human nature, especially the nature of the man who married his daughter. When we drafted the final revision of his will 6 months ago, he insisted on embedding a highly unorthodox, deeply buried protection clause. I advised him it was overly paranoid. He told me I simply did not understand the depths Grant Whitlock would sink to." She paused, and I could hear the faint rustle of heavy parchment paper over the audio connection. "I am reading the clause right now," Mara continued, her voice sending a sharp chill down my spine. "And I think your grandfather wrote this specific paragraph for the exact moment you are living through today." The line clicked and disconnected as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. I lowered the phone slowly to my lap. I turned my head and stared out the small, oval window at the sprawling, unbroken blanket of white clouds stretching out toward the horizon. The cold, sterile reality of the situation washed over me. Grandfather Javier had not just left me a vast fortune and a complicated legal duty. He had possessed the terrifying foresight to know my own blood would declare a vicious war against me. He knew they would play dirty, and he had secretly handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. The aircraft finally leveled off, and the severe turbulence that had rattled the cabin slowly faded into a steady, rhythmic hum. I reconnected the encrypted audio call with Mara Ellison. Her voice crackled slightly through the wireless internet connection, but her tone was razor-sharp and heavily focused. We had a rapidly shrinking window of time to construct a completely impenetrable defense before the judge took the bench. "You need to understand exactly what is at stake this morning," Mara explained rapidly, the rustle of legal files echoing through the receiver. "This preliminary docket is not a simple, ceremonial reading of the will. The presiding judge is going to rule on immediate, uncontested signature authority over the primary trust accounts. Whoever walks out of those heavy wooden doors today, possessing the title of executor, gets the physical checkbook. They get the routing numbers. They get absolute, unmonitored access to millions of dollars in liquid capital. That is precisely why your father is so desperate to intercept you. He needs that designation today." I pulled my silver laptop from my secondary canvas tote bag, balancing it carefully on the narrow plastic tray table. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced, auditor-level precision. "I am transmitting a secure, encrypted digital file to your private server right now," I told her. "It contains a high-resolution scan of the Vault Bridge custody receipt, a meticulously documented timeline of my morning at the airport, and the official verification hotline number. I need you to file an emergency exhibit immediately. We are putting the false report and the malicious interference directly on the court record before the judge even has a chance to bang the gavel." "Consider it done," Mara agreed, her voice thick with professional approval. "But Isla, listen to me very carefully. Do not just aim to win today. If you only parry this immediate strike, Grant will simply retreat, regroup, and find another vulnerable backdoor to exploit. You need to make it legally and physically impossible for them to ever invent a second lie." That was exactly how a senior compliance officer operated. I did not just fix the current error. I rebuilt the entire system to prevent future breaches. I laid out a comprehensive, three-layer strategy for Mara. Phase 1 was surviving the morning hearing and securing my rightful legal appointment as executor. Phase 2 involved executing an absolute, immediate freeze on all tangible and intangible assets. Phase 3 was actively paving a clear, legally sound, and unavoidable road for a formal criminal investigation into the financial behavior of Grant Whitlock. I can firmly secure Phase 3, I assured my attorney. Before I had departed the terminal, Sergeant Keats had handed me her official department business card featuring a direct, secure email address. During the initial ascent of my flight, I had reached out to her. Keats, still quietly furious about being weaponized for a family dispute, had already replied. She formally agreed to forward the official incident card, the registered name of the individual who placed the call, and the highly specific property description they provided to the emergency dispatch operator. Those granular, hyper-specific details were the absolute linchpin. They would categorically prove the caller possessed intimate, inside knowledge of my luggage and travel itinerary, completely destroying any potential defense that this was merely a random bystander's innocent misunderstanding. I want you to draft a secondary motion requesting the immediate appointment of a temporary independent fiduciary, I instructed Mara, my voice hardening. I do not want sole control over the capital right now, and I certainly will not allow my parents to touch a single dime. We are going to bring in a neutral, court-appointed, heavily bonded third party to lock down every single cent of the estate. I paused, letting the strategic weight of that decision settle. My father operates exclusively in the shadows, I continued. He relies entirely on financial matters remaining murky, private, and strictly in-house. He leverages his authority by controlling the flow of information. He is absolutely allergic to transparent paperwork, public records, and external corporate audits. Forcing an independent fiduciary into his life is the equivalent of turning on a stadium spotlight in a dark room. It will completely suffocate his operations. Mara hesitated. The heavy silence stretching over the digital connection felt thick and ominous. There is one more crucial detail, she finally admitted, her tone dropping an octave. I did not want to alarm you while you were actively mourning, but roughly 4 months before Javier passed away, his primary banking institution contacted my office. Their fraud department flagged a highly suspicious general power of attorney document that someone attempted to file on his behalf. The bank categorically rejected the document because the primary signature looked subtly, but noticeably, off balance. My blood ran completely cold, the chill seeping deep into my bones. A rejected power of attorney. A sudden, frantic, undocumented need for massive liquid cash before the close of business this Friday. The desperate, felony-level attempt to keep me physically away from the financial ledgers at the courthouse. The entire chaotic puzzle violently snapped together into a horrifyingly clear picture. This was no longer just a bitter, emotionally charged inheritance dispute fueled by familial ego and typical greed. If my father had actively attempted to forge binding legal documents while my grandfather was in a state of physical decline, this escalated into severe elder exploitation. It was systemic, calculated forgery. The dramatic stolen jewelry narrative at the airport was just a pathetic, noisy smokescreen designed to hide a much larger, far more sinister financial crime that he was desperately trying to cover up before the end of the week. He was not trying to get rich. He was trying to stay out of federal prison. Draft the fiduciary motion immediately, I told Mara, my voice devoid of any remaining familial sentiment. I will see you at the courthouse. I abruptly ended the call. I opened my secure email client and drafted a single, completely new message. I carefully added the email addresses of my father, my mother, and my brother to the recipient list. I did not use a polite greeting. I did not express any righteous anger, deep betrayal, or profound sorrow. I stripped every single ounce of emotion from my words, leaving only the cold, hard steel of a compliance directive. I typed exactly 2 sentences. I will be in court today. All future communication regarding this family or this estate must go directly through my legal counsel. I stared at the screen for 3 seconds, severing 30 years of emotional manipulation with one decisive keystroke. I hit send, snapped the silver laptop shut, and prepared myself for absolute war. The dry, high-altitude air of Santa Fe hit my lungs the second I stepped out of the rideshare vehicle. The adobe-style architecture of the county courthouse loomed ahead, a stark contrast to the sterile chrome of the Raleigh departure terminal. My body ached from the frantic cross-country sprint, the layover, and the sheer tension binding my muscles, but my mind was operating at maximum capacity. I walked through the metal detectors with practiced ease, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm against the polished terracotta floors as I navigated the winding corridors to courtroom 4. I pushed open the heavy oak doors exactly 4 minutes before the judge was scheduled to make her ruling. The scene inside was a masterclass in calculated theatricality. My parents sat at the petitioner's table, dressed in somber, impeccably tailored dark clothing. My mother, Diane, held a monogrammed handkerchief, occasionally dabbing at the dry corners of her eyes. My father, Grant, sat rigidly beside her, his head bowed in a perfect pantomime of a grieving patriarch burdened by family tragedy. Standing before the bench was their high-priced litigator, a man weaving a deeply sympathetic narrative for the court. "Your Honor," the lawyer intoned, his voice echoing with faux sorrow, "it brings the family no pleasure to request this emergency transition of executor duties, but as we have just informed the court, Isla Rivera is currently unreachable. We received a highly distressing notification this morning that she has been detained by law enforcement at an out-of-state airport due to a severe misunderstanding involving estate property. Given her clear emotional instability and physical absence, my client, Grant Whitlock, is humbly prepared to step in and secure the estate's vulnerable assets today." Judge Lorraine Carver, a woman with steel-gray hair and absolutely no patience for melodrama, adjusted her reading glasses. She picked up her pen, hovering the ink over the temporary executor authorization order. "Objection, Your Honor." Mara Ellison's voice rang out crisp and clear from the respondent's table. "My client is not detained, nor is she unstable. She is right here." I walked down the center aisle. I did not look like a frantic fugitive. I did not look like a broken, grieving daughter. I looked exactly like what I am, a senior compliance auditor arriving for a hostile review. I took my seat beside Mara, keeping my posture entirely neutral. I did not spare a single glance toward my parents, though I could feel the sudden, suffocating vacuum of air on their side of the room. Grant's head snapped up, the carefully constructed mask of sorrow slipping to reveal a flash of raw, unfiltered panic. "Ms. Rivera," Judge Carver said, lowering her pen slowly, "opposing counsel just entered a claim onto the record stating you were under police custody for the theft of estate assets. Do you care to clarify your current legal status before we proceed?" I opened my leather bag and withdrew the waterproof folder. I slid the documents silently to Mara. "We are prepared to do far more than clarify, Your Honor," Mara stated, standing tall. "We are submitting 2 immediate evidentiary filings. I present Exhibit A to the court. This is a certified, notarized chain of custody receipt from Vault Bridge Secure Logistics. It conclusively proves that the entirety of Javier Rivera's estate jewelry was inventoried, sealed, and locked inside a subterranean vault exactly 72 hours ago. Included is the authentication hotline and the specific alphanumeric seal code." Mara handed the copies to the bailiff, who walked them up to the bench. "Furthermore," Mara continued, her voice gaining a dangerous momentum, "I present Exhibit B. This is an official incident card provided directly by Sergeant Naomi Keats of the Airport Police Department. It documents the emergency call placed this morning. It explicitly states the complaint was thoroughly investigated and found to be entirely baseless. The officer noted that no theft occurred and the traveler was subjected to malicious interference." The courtroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The Whitlock lawyer looked rapidly back and forth between his clients and the bench, suddenly realizing he had been fed a highly explosive lie by his own retainers. My father, entirely incapable of relinquishing control even when cornered, made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. He leaned forward, speaking directly over his own attorney. "That receipt means nothing," Grant snapped, his voice tight and defensive. "The police were specifically looking for a black velvet pouch tucked into the front pocket of her carry-on bag. Anyone could have printed a fake paper receipt to cover up what was actually inside that pouch. He realized his catastrophic error the exact second the words left his mouth. Mara turned slowly, locking eyes with my father. "Your Honor," she said, her tone deceptively soft. "Please note for the record that Exhibit B does not specify the color of the pouch, nor does it detail which pocket of the luggage the police searched. The only people who knew those granular details were the police officers on the scene, my client, and the anonymous individual who placed the fraudulent dispatch call." Grant's face drained of all color. He sank back into his heavy wooden chair as if he had been physically struck. He had just practically confessed in open court to orchestrating a felony false report. "Your Honor." Mara pivoted back to the bench, abandoning all pleasantries. "Given the extraordinary evidence of bad faith and direct procedural interference demonstrated in this room today, we are immediately filing a motion to deny Mr. Whitlock's petition for temporary powers. Furthermore, we are formally requesting an absolute, immediate freeze on all estate assets. Lastly, we request the immediate appointment of an independent, court-certified fiduciary to take full investigative control of Javier Rivera's financial portfolio." Judge Carver stared at the documents in front of her. The judicial irritation radiating from the bench was palpable. She looked over her glasses directly at my father's attorney. "Counselor," Judge Carver said, her voice dropping into a register of pure ice, "you are extremely close to a sanctions hearing. The petition for temporary executor powers is denied with extreme prejudice. The motion for an immediate asset freeze is granted. I will be appointing an independent fiduciary by the close of business today." She struck her gavel, but she was not finished. "Additionally," the judge continued, fixing her gaze squarely on my parents, "I am placing a show cause hearing on the docket for next Tuesday. You will return to this courtroom and legally explain to me exactly how and why deliberately false information regarding a police detainment was entered into my court record to secure a financial ruling. We are adjourned." The sharp crack of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. I finally turned my head to look across the aisle. Grant was staring blankly at the mahogany table, completely paralyzed by the sudden, violent collapse of his timeline. He was trapped. But my mother was the one who captured my attention. Diane Whitlock was clutching her designer handbag. For the very first time in my entire life, I saw her manicured hands physically shaking. The tears welling in her eyes now were not a performance for the gallery. They were born of absolute, unadulterated terror. She had spent decades burying family sins under a thick veneer of high society perfection. But as she looked up at the court reporter furiously typing the final transcripts, the reality crashed down on her. The courtroom doors were open. The transcripts were printed. Her perfect, flawless image had just crossed over into the permanent, unforgiving realm of public record. I did not celebrate the courtroom victory. While Mara Ellison bought a round of expensive scotch for her paralegals to toast the dramatic temporary injunction, I walked straight out of the courthouse and went directly back to my rented suite. I ordered a pot of black coffee, closed the heavy blackout curtains, and spread my digital workspace across the large oak desk. I had won the morning skirmish, but the actual war was hiding deep inside the accounting ledgers. Mara moved with terrifying speed. By 4 o'clock that same afternoon, the court-appointed independent fiduciary was legally installed and granted absolute administrative access to my grandfather's financial universe. Because I was the legally named executor, I was permitted to review the preliminary probate discovery files as they were securely uploaded to the shared server. I cracked my knuckles and began doing exactly what Kestrel Arc Compliance pays me to do. I started digging a grave out of paperwork. I built a meticulous, chronological timeline mapping Grant Whitlock's behavioral anomalies against the estate bank statements. It took me exactly 4 hours and 2 pots of coffee to locate the bleeding artery, buried deep within the secondary operating account of my grandfather's primary holding company. I found a highly suspicious series of recurring wire transfers. They were vaguely categorized on the ledger simply as external strategic consulting fees, every single month, precisely on the 15th. A substantial, flat sum of money was routed out of the secure trust and deposited into a commercial account belonging to a limited liability company called Canyon Ledger Partners. A quick corporate registry search confirmed my immediate suspicion. The entity was a complete ghost. It was a classic shell company, registered in a jurisdiction with notoriously opaque corporate privacy laws. It possessed no functional website, no physical office address other than a registered post office box, and absolutely zero actual employees. It was a vacuum designed solely to suck capital out of a dying man's estate. But the true sickening shock arrived when I pulled the scanned authorization forms for the final 3 transfers to initiate those specific high-value outgoing wires. The banking institution required a physical, wet ink signature from the primary account holder. I pulled the digital scans onto my high-resolution monitor and magnified the images by 400%. The cursive loops spelled out Javier Rivera, but my blood immediately turned to ice. I knew my grandfather's handwriting intimately. He had taught me how to write in cursive when I was 7 years old. The signature glowing on my screen was a highly practiced, deliberate imitation. The slant was slightly too vertical, and the pen pressure completely lacked the natural, failing tremor of an 80-year-old man battling a terminal illness. The ink strokes were far too confident, pressing far too heavily on the baseline of the document. It was a textbook forgery, executed by someone who thought the bank clerks would not look closely enough at an established account to completely shatter any plausible deniability. I requested the daily medical logs from the palliative care nursing agency that attended to him during his final months. I cross-referenced the dates of the wire authorizations. The final document was purportedly signed and formally notarized in person at a downtown bank branch on November 18th, according to the strict medical charts. On the morning of November 18th, my grandfather was heavily medicated, hooked to a supplemental oxygen machine, and never left his bed. He was physically incapable of holding a heavy fountain pen, let alone traveling across town to execute a complex financial wire transfer. As I logged the massive discrepancy into my audit file, a secure email notification pinged on my screen. It was an update from Sergeant Naomi Keats. She had pulled the cellular carrier data from the emergency dispatch recording. The call had predictably originated from an untraceable prepaid mobile device purchased with cash. However, the caller made a fatal, arrogant linguistic error. In the official audio transcript, the disguised voice referred to the jewelry specifically as the Rivera Secondary Trust assets. That was a highly guarded, proprietary legal term used exclusively inside the walls of Mara Ellison's law firm and our immediate family living room. It was not a phrase a random airport thief or an observant bystander would ever use. The vocabulary alone completely incinerated the idea of an anonymous tipster. The call came from inside the house. The walls of the Whitlock family facade were beginning to buckle under the unseen pressure. At exactly 6 p.m, my mobile phone lit up with a frantic text message from Evan. He had finally spoken to his own defense attorney. The reality of a show cause hearing and a federally frozen estate had shattered his blind, arrogant loyalty to our parents. He asked me if the judge was actually going to involve the state police. He was completely terrified. He suddenly realized that blindly running banking errands and ferrying sealed envelopes for our father over the last year might make him an accessory to a major felony. I did not reply to him. I let the heavy silence amplify his panic. 30 minutes later, my mother attempted a vastly different angle. Diane bypassed the text messages entirely and left a breathless, weeping voicemail. She begged me to meet her for a quiet cup of tea at a neutral hotel lobby. She swore she just wanted peace and quiet, insisting that dragging the family name through a public courtroom was destroying her fragile health. She promised we could fix everything quietly and amicably if I just dropped the aggressive legal maneuvers and came back to the table. I maintained my absolute rule. I sent her a single, sterile email reply stating that I was completely unavailable for social meetings and reminding her that all communication must be routed strictly through my legal representation. I would not let her drag me back into the emotional swamp she historically used to control the family narrative. Instead of drinking tea and negotiating with my mother, I spent the rest of the evening assembling a very specific heavily indexed dossier. I systematically compiled the forged signature scans, the contradictory medical logs, the shell company registration data, and the airport incident report. I did not include my father's actual name on the cover page. I simply titled it as a report of suspected elder financial exploitation, systemic forgery, and fraudulent judicial interference. The following morning, I walked a hard copy of that thick binder directly to the intake desk of the local district attorney's financial crimes division. I handed it over anonymously, acting merely as a concerned auditor providing actionable, verified evidence of a crime. My father was currently pacing the floors of his pristine suburban living room, agonizing over how to outmaneuver me in a probate dispute to secure a massive inheritance. He still firmly believed we were fighting over a last will and testament. He had absolutely no idea I was actively transforming his inheritance dispute into a devastating criminal indictment. The atmosphere inside Mara Ellison's conference room on Thursday afternoon was suffocatingly tense. We were conducting a legally mandated mediation call with my parents and their deeply humiliated attorney. The aggressive, roaring patriarch who had tried to ambush me at the airport was completely gone. In his place was a man desperately attempting to pour honey over an open wound. Grant Whitlock's voice crackled through the high-fidelity speakerphone, dripping with a sickeningly sweet, paternal warmth I had not heard since I was a small child. He did not yell. He did not threaten. "Isla, sweetheart," my father murmured. "This has all gone terribly off the rails. The grief is making us all act out of character. Let us just put the swords down. I am perfectly willing to split the liquid assets 50-50 right now, half for you, half for your mother and me. We can settle this privately today and find some peace." Diane chimed in immediately, her voice trembling with weaponized sorrow. "Do you really want to completely destroy this family over paperwork? Isla, we are bleeding. We are mourning your grandfather. Please, just sign the settlement and come home." It was a beautifully coordinated emotional strike. 2 days ago, it might have made my stomach twist with guilt. Today, it felt like reading a poorly written phishing email. "I am perfectly willing to discuss a settlement," I replied, my voice as flat and reflective as a frozen lake. "My terms are very simple. Before I sign a single page, I require your legal counsel to submit the original, wet ink copy of the general power of attorney you attempted to file 4 months ago. I also require the complete, unredacted foundational contracts regarding an entity known as Canyon Ledger Partners." The silence that blasted through the speakerphone was absolute. It was the sound of a carefully constructed floor completely dropping out from under them. "I do not know what you are talking about regarding any power of attorney," my mother stammered quickly, her voice pitching up an entire octave. She was desperately dodging the legal snare. Terrified of being recorded acknowledging a forged document, Grant, however, could not maintain his composure. The mention of his phantom shell company shattered his sweet facade instantly. The honey evaporated, leaving only venom and panicked exhaustion. "You have absolutely no idea what you are doing," Grant hissed, his voice dropping into a ragged, breathless rasp. "You sit in your sterile little office judging everyone. You do not understand the immense, crushing pressure of the people who actually have to keep everything standing." He cut the connection abruptly. The dial tone echoed loudly in the conference room. Mara looked across the table at me, her eyebrows raised. I leaned back in my leather chair. Grant had just handed me the psychological cipher to his entire operation. He was not merely greedy. Greedy men want to buy new yachts and estates. Men who talk about the pressure of keeping things standing are terrified of a collapse. He was not trying to steal my grandfather's wealth to get richer. He was actively using it to plug a massive, catastrophic hole in his own financial life. He was hiding a monumental failure that, if dragged into the public record, would completely obliterate the Whitlock name. The collateral damage of his panic began to spread later that evening, at exactly 11:15 at night. My phone buzzed with a direct, private text message from my younger brother. Evan had bypassed the lawyers entirely. The message was a frantic, grammatically broken plea for salvation. He wrote that our father had forced him to take several sealed envelopes to a private public notary across town late last year. Evans swore he never read the documents inside. He begged me to believe him, pleading with me to save him from going to prison for a fraud he did not understand. I stared at the glowing screen in the dark. The golden child was finally cracking under the weight of his blind loyalty. I did not offer him familial comfort. I offered him a compliance directive. "If you want to survive this," I typed back smoothly, "you will contact the court-appointed fiduciary tomorrow morning. You will provide a sworn, written affidavit detailing every single time you transported documents for him, including the exact dates and the name of the notary. If you lie to protect him now, you will sink with him. Do not text me again." The final, devastating blow landed the very next afternoon. Mara summoned me back to her office for an emergency briefing. The independent fiduciary had spent the last 48 hours ripping through the floorboards of the estate's complex banking history, and they had struck a massive, highly toxic financial landmine. The fiduciary found a newly registered commercial debt instrument, Mara explained, sliding a thick stack of printed records across the desk. "It is a massive multi-million-dollar secured loan taken out by Grant's primary investment firm, but Grant did not have the collateral to secure it himself. The paperwork lists your grandfather, Javier Rivera, as the primary financial guarantor." I scanned the authorization page. The signature at the bottom of the guarantor agreement matched the exact, unnatural pen strokes I had found on the Canyon Ledger wire transfers. Grant had secretly leveraged a dying man's pristine credit to secure a massive corporate bailout for his own failing company. If that loan defaulted, the bank would legally seize the Rivera estate to cover the massive debt. That was the Friday deadline he was so desperate to meet. He needed to funnel cash out of the estate to pay the massive monthly premium on a fraudulent loan he secured by forging my grandfather's name. Less than an hour after the fiduciary formally filed that explosive discovery with the probate court, Grant's attorney called Mara in a state of absolute, unfiltered panic. The arrogant demands for temporary power were completely gone. The aggressive posturing was dead. The opposing counsel was now begging for mercy. He stated that Grant was willing to immediately withdraw his entire probate petition. He promised that Grant would walk away from the estate entirely, relinquish all claims, and even draft a formal public apology acknowledging his severe emotional distress and poor judgment, provided we instantly halted the fiduciary's investigation and withdrew the district attorney referral. He wanted to hit a magic undo button and pretend the last 4 days never happened. I stood up and walked over to the large windows overlooking the city. I thought about my father pacing in his living room, terrified of the impending show cause hearing, desperate to stuff his crimes back into the dark corners where he had hidden them for decades. I finally understood the absolute truth about men who rule through control and intimidation. When they suddenly beg for a quiet, peaceful resolution, it is never because they have found their conscience. It is simply because they are mortally terrified of the light. Late Friday afternoon, the chaotic dust from the fiduciary's explosive financial filing had barely settled inside the law office. Mara Ellison called me into her private suite, bypassing her usual sprawling conference room. She walked directly over to the heavy steel floor safe hidden behind a wooden panel, spun the combination dial, and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax. She handed it to me with a solemn, almost reverent expression. She explained that my grandfather had given her this specific envelope nearly a year ago. It came with strict, uncompromising, and legally binding instructions. Mara was explicitly forbidden from handing it to me until the probate court had officially appointed an independent fiduciary to lock down the estate. The trap had to be fully armed before I could be given the map. I broke the heavy wax seal with my thumb. Given the emotional weight of his recent passing, a small part of me expected a sentimental farewell letter. I expected final words of familial comfort or a quiet apology for leaving me to fight this brutal war alone. But Javier Rivera was never a man of soft sentiments. He was a brilliant tactician. Inside the envelope was a typed, highly organized strategic dossier. It was an auditor's absolute dream. The pages contained a meticulous index of hidden safety deposit boxes, offshore ledger access codes, and the private cellular numbers of 3 highly trusted, uncompromisable banking executives. But it was the introductory paragraph, typed in his crisp, traditional serif font, that completely stole the breath from my lungs. If you are reading this right now, Isla, it means they actively tried to prevent you from walking into that courthouse today. I stared at the ink, the sheer prophetic accuracy of his words sending a sharp, cold thrill down my spine. The memo proceeded to detail the hidden legal mechanism Mara had briefly hinted at during my flight. It was an aggressive, deeply buried forfeiture clause embedded securely within the trust's foundational bylaws. The clause dictated that any named beneficiary who deliberately attempted to strip me of my legal capacity or physical liberty through the use of fraudulent criminal accusations or malicious judicial interference would immediately, irrevocably forfeit their entire designated inheritance. Their share would instantly dissolve and be redirected into a highly restrictive charitable trust. However, there was a massive, carefully constructed caveat to prevent standard, petty family squabbles from accidentally triggering total disinheritance. The clause required a very specific burden of proof. It could only be activated by presenting absolute, independent, third-party evidentiary documentation of the malicious interference. Hearsay and personal accusations would not suffice. I lowered the paper to my lap, my auditor's brain rapidly connecting the disparate data points. My father currently believed his situation, while legally perilous, was still entirely negotiable. He thought his sudden, desperate offer to split the assets 50-50 would serve as a sufficient peace treaty. He assumed the false airport police tip was merely a failed tactical strike that we would eventually sweep under the rug to avoid public embarrassment. He had absolutely no idea that his aggressive opening move had already sealed his total destruction. The Vault Bridge certified transport receipt, the rigorous chronological communication timeline I had built on the airplane, and Sergeant Naomi Keats's official badge-numbered airport incident card were not just my temporary defensive shields. They were the exact, undeniable independent evidence the forfeiture clause demanded. Meanwhile, the Whitlock family unit, historically bound by secrets and forced loyalty, was rapidly devouring itself from the inside out. Through the network of legal paralegals, I learned that my mother had entirely abandoned her united front. Diane Whitlock had quietly retained her own separate, highly aggressive defense counsel. She was actively preparing to sever all marital and financial ties with Grant. She was loudly claiming to her lawyers, her friends, and anyone who would listen that she was merely a kept, ignorant woman who knew absolutely nothing about his shadow companies or forged documents. She was frantically cutting his safety rope in a desperate bid to preserve her own pristine social image from the impending criminal fallout. Then came the final, undeniable piece of the forgery puzzle. True to my strict written ultimatum, my brother Evan did not attempt to call or text me with emotional pleas again. Instead, he chose self-preservation. He forwarded a massive digital file directly to the independent fiduciary's secure evidentiary portal. It contained a chain of old, heavily encrypted emails between Evan and our father. In the most damning exchange, dated exactly 4 months prior, Grant had attached a high-resolution scanned copy of the rejected, forged power of attorney. The body of Grant's email contained a single, glaringly toxic directive. He instructed Evan to print the attached document, drive it to a specific public notary they kept on a quiet retainer, and absolutely not to ask any questions about the signature. It was the direct, undeniable digital bridge connecting Grant Whitlock's personal computer to the execution of the forged legal document. By the time the courthouse formally closed its doors for the weekend, Judge Lorraine Carver had fully reviewed the fiduciary's preliminary financial findings and the newly submitted email chain from Evan. She did not just confirm the upcoming show cause hearing on the public docket, she escalated the legal stakes to their absolute maximum limit. The judge issued a formal, written notice to all parties involved. If the upcoming evidentiary hearing confirmed the systemic forgery and fraudulent debt procurement, she would immediately refer the entire docket to the state attorney general for major felony prosecution. I sat completely alone in the quiet law office, the late afternoon sun casting long, heavy shadows across the polished mahogany table. I looked down at the typed forfeiture clause resting gently in my hands, tracing my grandfather's signature at the bottom of the final page. The sheer, terrifying brilliance of his final, posthumous maneuver washed over me in a wave of profound respect. I folded the heavy paper carefully and slid it back into the wax-sealed envelope. Grandfather Javier did not just leave me a vast financial fortune to manage, he left me a trap. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4 swung closed on Tuesday morning, sealing us all inside for the mandated show cause hearing. The air was thick and completely stagnant. Grant Whitlock sat at the petitioner's table, his previous arrogance entirely replaced by a gray, sweating desperation. Diane sat as far away from him as the wooden bench would physically allow, her eyes fixed firmly on her own separate legal counsel. Evan was seated in the gallery behind them, nervously wringing his hands. Judge Lorraine Carver called the court to order precisely at 9 o'clock. She did not waste a single breath on pleasantries. She immediately called our first witness. Sergeant Naomi Keats stepped into the witness box, looking immaculate in her dress uniform. Under Mara Ellison's precise questioning, the officer laid out the exact sequence of events from the airport terminal. Keats read directly from her official incident card. She detailed how the anonymous caller possessed an impossible level of intimate knowledge regarding my travel itinerary, my specific luggage brand, and the exact interior pocket where a black velvet pouch was allegedly stored. Keats looked directly at the judge and stated that in her professional law enforcement experience, this was not a tip from a concerned bystander. It was a targeted, malicious hit orchestrated by someone who had been inside my home. Grant swallowed hard, his chest heaving nervously, but the devastation was only just beginning. The court-appointed fiduciary took the stand next, carrying a thick binder of financial autopsies. The independent investigator formally entered the forged general power of attorney into the public record. They detailed the fraudulent monthly consulting fees funneled directly into the Canyon Ledger Partners shell company. Then, the fiduciary dropped the absolute heaviest weight onto the scales. They presented the multi-million-dollar commercial loan document, explicitly highlighting my grandfather's blatantly forged signature securing the massive debt. My father completely snapped. The illusion of the controlled, powerful patriarch shattered into a million jagged pieces right there in open court. He frantically stood up and interrupted the proceedings, wildly pointing a shaking finger at his own family. He shouted that he knew nothing about the loan mechanics, claiming his son Evan handled all the physical paperwork and notary runs. When that failed to sway the judge, Grant pivoted desperately to his wife, accusing Diane of demanding the offshore money to fund her lavish philanthropic lifestyle. He was willing to throw his own flesh and blood directly under the wheels of a criminal indictment to save himself. Mara did not even raise her voice. She simply handed the bailiff the printed copies of the encrypted emails Evan had surrendered. The judge read Grant's own digital words, explicitly commanding his son to blindly notarize the forged documents. The paper trail was absolute. Judge Carver slammed her gavel down, her face a mask of pure judicial fury. She ordered Grant to sit down and remain completely silent. The ruling was swift and utterly merciless. The judge ordered the total asset freeze to remain in permanent effect. She formally stripped Grant of any right to petition for estate access and barred him from coming within 500 feet of any financial document bearing the Rivera name. Most devastatingly, she signed an official judicial order transferring the entire evidentiary file directly to the State Attorney General's office for immediate criminal prosecution regarding elder financial exploitation and systemic forgery. But the final, fatal blow did not come from the bench. It came from my grandfather. Before the judge could formally adjourn the session, Mara stood up. She held the heavy, cream-colored parchment paper in her hands. She informed the court that Javier Rivera had anticipated this exact, malicious interference and had embedded a dormant protection mechanism deep within the trust bylaws. Mara read the forfeiture clause aloud for the public record. She read the specific provisions stating that if any beneficiary attempted to deliberately strip the primary executor of their legal capacity through fraudulent criminal accusations, their entire inheritance would be instantly nullified and redirected into a locked charitable trust, while my portion remained safely shielded in a separate, untouchable account. The courtroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Mara presented the certified airport receipt, the timeline, and the police testimony as the required independent proof of that exact malicious interference. The realization hit Grant with the physical force of a freight train. He collapsed back into his heavy wooden chair, all the breath rushing out of his lungs in a ragged gasp. The false police report he had orchestrated to win the morning hearing had become the exact mechanism that legally disinherited him forever. By trying to steal the keys, he had welded the vault shut from the inside. Diane buried her face in her hands, softly sobbing, but she was not crying for my grandfather or her fractured marriage. She was weeping for her destroyed social currency. The courtroom doors were wide open. The transcripts were public. Her worst nightmare had materialized. The Immaculate Whitlock reputation was now permanently synonymous with elder abuse and felony fraud. In the gallery, Evan quietly signed a formal cooperation agreement with the state investigators. By choosing to finally speak the truth and surrender the digital evidence, he had successfully extracted himself from our father's toxic orbit. He would face consequences, but he had chosen truth over control. When Judge Carver finally dismissed the court, I did not stay to watch my parents argue with their frantic attorneys. I packed my silver laptop into my leather bag and walked out of the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the bright, high-altitude sun of Santa Fe. I took a deep, unfiltered breath of clean air. I did not feel the fiery, arrogant rush of vengeance. I did not feel the need to gloat. I just felt incredibly, profoundly light. I felt like a tired accountant who had finally, after 30 years of carrying a fraudulent burden, placed a perfectly balanced ledger down on a desk and walked away forever. The debt was settled. The books were closed. Looking up at the clear blue sky, I thought about Javier Rivera and the final, brilliant lesson he left behind for me. If they use the law to bind you, you must use the law to untie yourself. If your family ever turned you into the villain, just so they could keep control, please tell me where you are listening from down in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your ultimate support by hitting the tap like and subscribe so this story can be heard by even more people.